This is Paul, still in my mother's basement for now, heading back to Sacramento not too long. Peterson did a conversation with Lex Fridman where he talked about the course that he did in Peterson Academy on Nietzsche. And then Peterson talked about the fact that he wanted to do another course on Iliada in Peterson Academy. And I thought that would be excellent because Peterson, of course, speaks highly of Iliada and leans into him for a lot of his material. I also have a conversation coming up with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. I arranged this one because I wanted to talk to John Vervaeke and I wanted to have Jonathan Pageau involved too with the topic of the advent of the sacred. Now, Vervaeke is doing a course with the symbolic world on ritual, and they had just sort of a half-hour conversation on the open channel with Pageau. I haven't seen the installment of the courses that Vervaeke is doing with Pageau, but the teaser that they gave on the channel was excellent. Part of the reason I want to talk with John Vervaeke about the advent of the sacred, and again, it's terrific to have Pageau involved, is because, well, Advent is, of course, the Christian season that's coming. Advent is a word about coming, and Advent in the Christian liturgical calendar is about both the first and second coming. It's about the movement towards us. And the sacred is a word that I'm very interested in how people are using, because the word sacred has gotten disconnected from its roots: sacred, sacral, sacrifice. And I thought that Iliada would be the profane and the sacred would be a super good way to sort of brush up on a bunch of these ideas that are deeply symbolic and connected to all sorts of understanding with respect to just sort of the basic human symbolic orientation. Iliada, of course, is looking across religious spectrums. And in looking across religious spectrums, he's looking not just at, let's say, biblical imagery, but he's looking at imagery from around the world and looking for ways that the biblical imagery and imagery around the world connect in terms of this basic symbology of a basic language of symbology that's widely shared across human existence. Now, of course, both Peterson and Vervaeke will approach this in slightly different ways. Peterson will approach it psychologically, obviously very much learning a lot from Jung. Vervaeke's going to approach it in terms of cognitive science, looking at philosophy, of course, but also in terms of the exaptation and a lot of the sort of the basic functionality that then gets played out in religious symbolism. And of course, that's sort of where Pageau comes in. And you can see where Peterson, Vervaeke, and Pageau are all sort of mapping parallel but connected approaches at ways that humanity, far beyond just the biblical, or let's say the Vedic, or the Mesopotamian, or the Egyptian, there is sort of a basic language that is beneath the religious traditions that many of these traditions are playing with, and Iliada, of course, gets into that. Now, the sacred is one of them. And when we talk about the advent of the sacred, the coming of the sacred, obviously, John Vervaeke is using that to address the meaning crisis, because a big provocation of the meaning crisis is the loss of the sacred. Iliada deals with this early on in his book with comparing religious man and modern man, Now, part of what Iliada does is sort of assume the definitions of the modern definition of religious in this, which is something to sort of keep an eye on as you read through the book. It's an important distinction, especially now in the age of modernity and beyond. I'm not using modernity as a synonym for contemporary. I'm using modernity as a, I don't know how my mother would feel if I'm using the basement as her backdrop. It's she continues to clean out the basement. She's a very conscientious person, and she wants her matters settled by the time the Lord calls her home. She's in her mid-80s, and she's very healthy, and she's very sharp. So who knows when that is, but she continues to sort of go through papers and pictures and all of these things here in the basement. And I think the idea is to have the house ready, have her house in order by the time the Lord calls her home. Anyway, I'll just use the basement as my backdrop. This is often where I sleep when I come to her house. Now, part of what's helpful about the sacred, the first chapter 1 of Iliada's book, he's into sacred space, and he goes through the pole, the pillar, the tree, the temple, everything sort of connecting heaven and earth. And of course, the gods are in heaven. You have the earth, and you have under the earth. And the Bible shares this basic architecture of human meaning and of cosmology, of course. You know, C.S. Lewis writes about this in The Discarded Image, how this basic image of the world is disrupted by modernity, when the physics of Earth and the physics of space are one and not separate, where space is now empty and void. Of course, Vervaeke goes through all of this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, walks through a lot of these elements. Now, the advent of the sacred, if, of course, you have a geographical element to that in terms of coming, advent, but what's super disrupted in the modern period, and again, I don't mean modern as synonymous with contemporary, I mean modernity, this period that destroys the, or discards the image, as C.S. Lewis says. When you think about the sacred in this space, and this is what I really want to get into with Vervaeke, and to really have Pageau present for that, because what's nice about Pageau with respect to Iliada is that Pageau, with his mastery of symbolism, really helps to fill in and illustrate and point to symbolisms and how those are all around us still. Even though modernity has discarded the classical and medieval image of the world, that image continues to be, it continues to haunt us, because it continues to be present in our world in a variety of ways. Modernity was not able to completely dispel the symbolisms that are around us. Of course, they remain in religious communities, but they continue to remain in rituals and family. The presence of the architecture of the traditional world, which was unself-consciously religious, continues in our midst and continues to afford meaning and to afford structure and to afford community and all of these things that we can't live without. And I suspect that when these things are dispelled and discarded and exorcised from our world, nihilism sets in. So when you have the advent of the sacred, okay, What exactly is coming near us? Now, Charles Taylor, in A Secular Age, tries to put language on this and tell stories of it. He's very much in debt to Iliada in terms of his observations about sacred space and sacred time. But now sacred, when you get to sacred, you very much get to sacrifice. On the church channel, early on, I did a video. It's the most watched video on my church channel. That doesn't say much. It's not a very big channel. But way before I started doing anything with Jordan Peterson on YouTube, I was playing with YouTube a little bit, and I made a video explaining altars. I made a similar video on my channel at one point. Now, altars are very much connected with trees and pillars, because what altars do is create a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. That's what altars do. Altars connect heaven and earth. Many cosmology stories begin with the death of something. One of the most famous, Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk slays Tiamat. Tiamat, in that sense, sort of becomes the sacrifice that founds the world. And Iliada, Sacred and Profane, is a fairly small book. Iliada, talks about the center of the world, the navel of the world, Jerusalem, whatever the holy city and the holy place. And again, even in Jerusalem, you have an altar. You have the sea, you have the altar, you have the temple, all of those elements that sort of construct the world of the Hebrews are right there in Jerusalem. And again, various societies do that. And what war really is trying to get a grasp on, well, what is the true center of the world? I've been thinking a lot about the fact that there are various worlds that we do inhabit, and part of what the pervasive pluralism of our overlapping societies and the sort of disconnect from the sacred has meant that we have these, it of course deals with domicide, but many just construct these little worlds, and worlds are often sort of constructed now via logos. There's a real tension in the Bible between what let's say is sort of the fixed worlds that are deeply enacted in the architecture and the liturgy and the worship in, let's say, Catholic and Orthodox, and then sort of this logos-based world that really comes to the fore in Protestantism and modernity. And I think you can point to foundations of that in the Scripture in both ways, because the Genesis 1 story in particular, and going into Genesis 2 and 3, now Genesis 4 is interesting because you have your first murder. And one of the things that I pointed out about Genesis 1 through 3 many times is the complete absence of an altar in Genesis 1 through 3. The first altar happens in Genesis 4 with the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. And so the Bible holds sort of this question of the relationship with cosmos and sacrality. Sacrality founded and based in altars holds that intention. Because, of course, you have the recreation of the world and the beginning of new time and the beginning of the age to come and the beginning of heaven and earth, obviously, in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross and in the empty tomb and in the resurrection. Jesus emerges from the ground, out of the tomb, into the world, and then ascends into heaven in order to bring a new heavens and a new earth to the world, and the old heavens and the old earth go away. That, of course, is laid out in the book of Revelation, but you can find that pointed to in a number of other places in the New Testament. So part of the challenge that Vervaeke is going to face is, of course, founding the sacred, refounding the sacred, especially in an age when the sacrifice of Christ, the completed sacrifice of Christ on the cross, to telestai, it is finished, ends bloody altars. Now, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran churches continue with altars, but of course the altars are transformed. Even the Christian Reformed Church cleaned up the Heidelberg Catechism with respect to thinking about altars in churches as, I think Iliada and Charles Taylor are helpful with respect to that, with respect to understanding how altars function and how priests function in these churches that remain, that continue to have altars. Now, Protestants will sometimes, out of habit, continue to refer to the front of the church as an altar, but of course, in Protestant churches, Calvinist churches, you have meeting houses. That's functionally how they are. And of course, the living sacrifices are in the church. The church is made up of the people, and the people pick up their crosses, and the crosses and the sacrifices happen in the lives of the people, so that sacral element does not go away. Even in Protestant churches, it's sort of relocated, and it is taken out of the space of wood and stone that create altars, and into the space of the people's lives. That's a significant movement that happened in the Protestant Reformation. And in many ways, that once again, the Protestant Reformation was tremendously pervasive, and it, in many ways, in the psychological world of Jordan Peterson and it'll be interesting again to see how John Vervaeke deals with it. Those are the kinds of questions I'm bringing to that conversation. And again, having Jonathan Pageau with his symbolism and his orthodoxy, I think will make a very interesting partner in those conversations. It's scheduled 2 hours, but 2 hours can't begin to cover that entire topic. It is so deep and so rich. And again, I just really want to probe. And part of the reason for putting out this video is to begin to set the table for that conversation. Because in many ways, for an Orthodox icon carver like Jonathan Pageau, well, he's always got his hands on the sacred. Because, of course, there's sacrality in the icons, in a way. And Jonathan can, enlighten me with respect to that. And the remains of sacrality inhabit the earth in many different ways. Iliada, of course, goes through, you have the city, the temple, and the home. There's sacrality in all of those three. And those three very much fractal: the home, the temple, the city, the world. The people, the world, the nation, the world, on and on and on up. And again, Pageau will be very helpful with that. And so, with respect to now, in a deeply Protestant world, where is the sacred? For Protestants, of course, the sacred is embodied in the ecclesia, in the gathering of the people. The people themselves are the living stones, the temple. Now, of course, I don't think I would have an argument with Orthodoxy or with Catholicism with respect to that. But of course, Catholicism and Orthodoxy instantiate those things in wood and stone, in altar, in rail, in iconostasis, in priests. Protestants, of course, aren't completely without that, but again, they tend to instantiate it in logos and flesh, more than wood and stone. And again, I think that actually the tension between Protestant and Orthodox has a lot to do with the tension in the Hebrew Scriptures with respect to mercy, not sacrifice, and many of those themes that are in the Old Testament. Those tensions just run straight through the Bible. So it's not my, anybody who's followed this channel for a long time knows it is one thing I do not want to do is just to simply reinflame tensions between Protestants and the other, and the Orthodox and the Catholics. In fact, I would rather have us have a better understanding of the different modes that Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestants are actually working, and the biblical foundations for these approaches. And in many ways, the Orthodox and the Catholics are sort of united in that, and the Protestants are over here. But I think between them, they hold the tension between those themes in Scripture with respect to logos and enfleshment versus instantiation in stone and wood. So yeah, and that's part of the reason that I initiated this with Pageau and Vervaeke, because I know how I have, I've never really pursued it or tried to instantiate it. I have a pretty good understanding how Catholics and Orthodox would do it. I have a sense of how it is done in Protestants. I'm super curious about how it's done in non-theism or even, I guess, in Neoplatonism, especially post-Protestant. And I'm sure John will be able to enlighten us on other traditions that he knows certainly better than I do, and probably better than Jonathan does. So I was reading Iliada tonight, and my mother and I were watching the football game, and then my mother went to bed, and so I thought, well, it's a good time to make a video, because I wanted to get these thoughts here to really set up the Pageau and Vervaeke conversation, because Advent, sacred, that's so massive. And I wanted to give them a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of how I set this up. And I think it's super important, especially for the Silk Road project, because, and I think also for, Elizabeth Oldfield and her project, because, okay, what on earth do we mean by the sacred? When I talk to people as a pastor, almost everyone I work with is deeply secular, whether they go to church or not. Again, part of why I approach what I do is because I think often the line between church people and unchurched people is very thin with respect to many of these issues. Church people are deeply secular, and the vestiges of sacrality continue to haunt even those who don't participate in religion. And so when we're having conversations, and I saw the Elizabeth Oldfield's very interesting conversation with the woman who's a psychic, witch, New Ager. She was reluctant with a bunch of those labels, but embraced them to a degree. Even highly secular people continue to have performative expressions of the sacred, cognitive, emotional, experiential appropriations of sacrality. I think John Vervaeke is right that, without sacrality, you cannot have a world. Well, what is a world? We could talk about that. Because most of us live in multiple worlds. My church is a world. My family is a world. My extended family is a world. Here, when I'm traveling to the East Coast and communing with other elements of my family, that's a world. And we easily use that language and appropriate that language, and it's appropriate to it. But the advent of the sacred, I just read Douthat's column that he did tiny little reviews on David Bentley Hart's new book and Spencer Klavin's new book and Rod Dreer's new book. And of course, Dreer's book is about Re-enchantment. I've got an advanced copy of it, but I haven't made my way through it yet. I'm the bane of publishers. They send me books. I read them when I want to. I keep telling you, I'm a very selfish YouTuber. So in Vervaeke's project, and I think as, you know, he's spoken of, he's, I think, much more, the Silk Road Project, I'll say it this way, the Silk Road Project is much more amenable to the reappropriation of traditional religions. And I think, you know, this is where I'm sort of in the middle of, let's say, Vervaeke and Pageau. You know, when I see former Protestants and people who maybe didn't go to a Protestant church, but very much are the product of a Protestant world, going to orthodoxy, I see that reappropriation of traditional legacy religions. I tend to see those religions, I gotta move carefully, this will follow me, but I don't want to tip it over. The repristination of those religions happens. There was someone on Twitter, no, it was in the comment section, complaining to me about all the former evangelicals in among the Orthodox. He was complaining because the particular Orthodox that he knew, part of what he liked about them was that they were deeply non-Protestant or non-evangelical or non-conservative. And now he's finding some of those impulses within the Orthodox Church. And so it's always a two-way street. When someone converts into a religion, especially when whole communities convert into a religion, more often than not, they change the religion that they go into. It's a continuous process. At the estuary retreat that I did at my sister's place, you know, it's a lot of fun spending time. There were 3 Roman Catholics that came to the retreat. And, you know, the more I learn, I'm always trying to get my head around the Catholic Church because it is just this massive, massive thing. And a super important thing for Western civilization, obviously, but I just cannot help but continue to see the ways that the Roman Catholic Church continues to have to remake itself, not only locally and regionally, but historically. When I look at the changes in the papacy over the last 90, 100 years, it's just astounding. It's just absolutely astounding. And even to the degree that some want to sort of roll back Vatican II, the changes are simply so massive that even if pieces of it are rolled back, much of it will remain. That's the way these things go. So, in terms of Vervaeke's project, there's going to be so much code swapping, a lot of it under the waterline. And you see that now with people rediscovering Orthodoxy or Catholicism, or even various elements of Protestantism. So I wanted to get some of these ideas down. I wanted to get them out there so that, I'll make sure that Jonathan and John get this, and that'll hopefully give us a setting for our conversation. And I also do it just for the simple task of note-taking. I did some playing around with ChatGPT today and annoyed a bunch of people. I had ChatGPT write articles for different publications in the Christian Reformed Church based on different positions on the divide of it. And it wrote articles that it even gave the authors for the articles Dutch last names. I thought, wow. And I see how that is going to just force everyone to up their game in terms of the relevance realization that tries to stay ahead of the machine. Just open another topic. I'm a terrible YouTuber. All right, so there are my notes on the upcoming conversation with Pageau and Vervaeke. And I was the one who, between the three of us, we usually talk when one of us sort of has an idea to initiate. The last conversation I did with John Vervaeke, I initiated, or he initiated, we sort of both did with IFS, and it went on John's channel first. My last conversation with Jonathan was sort of a catch-up after ARC and a lot of what was going on in the symbolic world. And so this one will be we haven't done one with the three of us for a while, but I think this topic of the advent of the sacred nicely becomes a common space between us, which I think really gets at the projects that each of us has. Jonathan Pageau, of course, working on the symbolic world and the repristination and the re-entry of stories and fairy tales, as Martin Shaw says, as sort of the purveyor of wisdom within a culture. And of course, John Vervaeke on addressing the meaning crisis and pluralism through the philosophical Silk Road. And again, in both of the conversations that I had with Jonathan and I had with John, both of them in those, when I was pressing them about the Vervaeke Foundation, the symbolic world, said, their primary goal is not to establish a community. Whereas in some ways, community is, I'm a pastor. It's the sort of the focus of pastors. My goal is community, and not necessarily a community that I establish and contain within the boundaries of an organization or the walls of a building. That's sort of I didn't bring my water bottle down. We're going to have to get that. That's sort of a perpetual thing that some people in the corner stumble over. Because it's not been my goal to establish a new Protestant church. I'm still not tremendously clear on the type of community or communities, yes, via estuary, but estuaries are in some ways always communities in service of other things. And part of that is of course, because I, in my day job, am already a minister of a community, Living Stones, the Christian Reformed Church, for as long as Living Stones and the Christian Reformed Church endure. And those are open question. These Protestant denominations so often become like paper bags. They're temporary holders for people to get from one place to another. So maybe that's good enough. I'll have to My mother has not a great internet connection. It'll take a little while to upload this, but yeah. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.